Okay, so let's take a look into depth of field. Now we have two ways to add depth of field. We can do this within our 3D program, or we can do it within the compositing program. And there are pros and cons to each choice. So in compositing, if we choose to add this, then we have a lot of control over how much depth of field we want. We also have an ease of timing in the rack focus if we choose to do that. We can also change the bokeh whenever we want. So if we change our minds later, it's not rendered into the image. And this way also offers us creative freedom in general. Now, although some plugins are better than others at creating depth of field and interpreting depth of field, one thing that you get is it's not 100% realistic, and there are some issues when we're trying to calculate or create the image or the pixels behind the immediate foreground if we're using a heavy shallow depth of field where something close to the camera is very blurred essentially. So because of this, it does require a bit of pre-planning and maybe a little bit of splitting up our frames. Now, if we look at the 3D depth of field, the first pro is that it's accurate and it will also be realistic. So you can be sure that you get the best overall final result, but this is not only render intensive, it also comes at the expense of the creative freedom, because we are then locked into the final render and the render itself is pretty heavy. And we need a lot of samples to remove the noise. So let's look at both, but first we'll take a look at Houdini. Okay, so setting it up in 3D is very simple. We have two main controls here. If I look within the camera, I go to the depth of field tab here and I enable depth of field. We have two main controls, which are the focal distance and the aperture size. So if we look in the 3D viewport and find the camera, if I hit enter on the camera in the viewport, I get this gizmo with this manipulator. And if I change this here, you can see I change the focal distance or the focus distance. And for me, 12 is fine, so I'll leave it there. And the aperture size changes how extreme the depth is. So higher values makes it more blurred, smaller values makes it less blurred. So let's take a look at the renders here. Here is the render without any depth of field, of course. And here it is with the depth of field applied. So you can see what we get here. We get a nice bokeh in the highlights or the higher values. And we get a nice transition from sharp into less sharp, more depth of field, and completely out of focus in the back. So the difference in render time though was something like 2 minutes, if that, maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes, to something closer to 10. And that's because I had to put the samples up as high as 12 and 20 just to get it this clean, and you can see it's still a little bit noisy. So that's what I meant when I said it's a little bit more render intensive. So to get this amount of out of focus, the aperture is set to 0.1 and the aspect ratio here is set to 2 to double the size on the height, and that's just to stretch it a little bit and make it feel a little bit more anamorphic. If we went the opposite way, we would spread it horizontally. So the other options we have are the aperture blades. If I zoom in here, you can see that these little bokehs are 5-sided pentagons, and we could change this to 8 or 10. We can increase the curvature so it becomes more round, and of course we can change the rotation. So in general, that's all you need to do to set up depth of field in 3D, but you need to make sure you're happy with it before you render it, as it is render intensive, as I said. So let's take a look at the compositing side, and we'll jump into Fusion and set up some stuff in there. So I have the render here, and I also have a couple of little effects. I added a glow and a lens flare here just to add a little bit of finish, but in general this is the render. straight out from Houdini. And I have set up some of the other ways to add depth of field in comp. So the first one I want to look at is the depth blur node. You can see that here. And to set this up, what it wants is the Z depth within the image itself. So to add this in, similar to what we did with the position, is we add the Z depth into the extra channels. So if I look at the channel boolean here, and this is set to copy, do nothing, do nothing, do nothing, nothing. In the AUX channels, I have enabled extra channels, and in the Z buffer, I'm taking the blue foreground from this, which is the Z depth. You might be familiar with this from the previous lesson. Let me just show you what that looks like. So we have this, and this is the blue channel that's been transferred onto the Z buffer of this image here, which is the render without any depth of field. So once I plug this into the depth blur, you can see what we get. Now, immediately, you can see a few things. The first one is we get a much cleaner effect on the background here, but we also get some artifacts. This is because it's not so easy for some of these nodes to accurately interpret the Z depth itself, or the depth in space. What we also get is we get a little bit of blur around the foreground image that we don't want to be out of focus. And you can see here it's also having a bit of a hard time finding what should be in and out of focus here too. But in general, it does a decent job. Not good enough at the moment, unfortunately. Again, a little bit of glow, a little bit of lens flare just to finish it off so we can compare the two. And if we switch between the final render and what we get in comp, you can see we get a much nicer result in the background, but a much better result overall on the render. So that is the depth blur. The options we have here are the blur size, so we can change the stretch on the bokeh, similar to what we did in Houdini. We have the option here to pick the focal point, so this would just be us choosing the focal point in Z depth, and you can see that dance around there. And then finally, we can increase or decrease the amount of depth of field by taking this down, and increase and decrease how much of the area around is within focus. So let me just undo this for now. So another node we have is the vary blur, and this is again very similar. You can see what it's doing here. It does a similar result, arguably not as good, but the main background is a little cleaner. The only difference is we can't quite change the size of the bokeh here. So very similar to the depth blur, very similar options, except we can't change the size. I mean, we do have the option, but it's kind of difficult to get it to do what we want. So in general, I would just not go with that one. So we've looked at the depth blur, the vary blur, and now we're looking at the defocus node. Now I'm using this in two ways. In this one, this is creating a custom tool, and I picked this up from a video I found on YouTube, which just lets you remap the Z depth. It's nothing too intricate, but I will send a link round of how to set this up. But in general, it's doing very much the same thing. It's adding the Z depth to the Z channel here. It's remapping the Z depth, and I'm using this as a mask on this defocus node. Now the defocus node is probably the most powerful. It lets us choose the lens type, it lets us change the sides and the shape, very similar to what we do in Houdini, but it also lets us change the bloom threshold and the bloom level, because in general, when we begin to knock things out of focus, things get a little bit brighter, especially the brighter values become a little bit brighter, and we get a bloom, we get a little bit of a overlap on some of these values. So that's something we want to try and recreate within any defocus that we use. So this works quite well, but to be honest, it's still giving us the artifacts around the out of focus stuff in the foreground, and it's also, you can see what it's supposed to look like versus what it does. Now again, in some cases it might be usable, but not quite for me. And the final option we have in comp is, with a little bit of pre-planning, setting it up in such a way that we can split the foreground from the background. Now again, this isn't as accurate, but it does give you a nicer result without any immediate artifacts. So what I have done here is I have split the foreground from the background here, and I have applied a defocus to just the background. Now what I have done is I have resized it to make it double the size, applied the defocus, and resized it back down to get this stretch. And this was only just me doing some tests. If we wanted to, we could just do this within the X and Y size here instead. So this works, and what we get here is a good balance between the render times, as they're pretty quick because we're not doing the depth of field in the render, and also the cleanliness of the render itself. Now of course this wouldn't be 100% accurate, but considering these options here are free, they do a decent job. Now unfortunately, the only way to get 100% accurate depth of field or 100% accurate rack focus, or the more complex depth of field you might need for your scene, then you need to render that into the image. Now Nuke and Fusion both have great plugins. Peregrine Labs PG Bokeh for Nuke and Frischluft's Lens Care for Fusion will get you much closer to reality in comp, but these both cost a fair amount of money, the Nuke version being a bit cheaper. However, if you want to do serious depth of field and you don't want to up your render times, then these are what I would recommend. Okay, so that about wraps up depth of field. I'm not using it in my renders, but I did want to give it a proper look since it's important, and you might want to do it in your own. Okay, so thanks.